Some promises break your heart twice, once when you make them, and again when you're forced to keep them. Colton Briggs thought he'd buried his past, along with his love for Evelyn Grace, but 20 years later, fate came calling in the cruelest way possible. The preacher's daughter was dying, and the whole town of Mercy Ridge demanded he marry her before she passed. Colton had become the richest man in 3 counties, but no amount of money could change what he'd done to her all those years ago. As he stood beside her deathbed in his finest suit, holding her frail hand while she wore her mother's wedding dress, something stirred in his hardened heart. The town thought they were just giving a dying woman her final wish. They had no idea this wedding would uncover a secret that would shake an entire town. What could a dying bride possibly reveal that would shake an entire town? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The memories came flooding back as Colton Briggs stepped into the small chapel where it all began. 28 years ago, he'd been nothing more than a scrawny 12-year-old boy with dirt under his fingernails and patches on his knees, sitting in these same wooden pews beside his father during Sunday service. That was before everything changed, before he learned that love wasn't enough when you had nothing else to offer. Mercy Ridge, Montana had always been the kind of town where everyone knew everyone else's business, where secrets were as rare as snow in July, and where a man's worth was measured not by the size of his heart, but by the size of his bank account. The town sat nestled in a valley between rolling hills that turned golden in autumn and white in winter, with Main Street running straight as an arrow from the train depot to the old mining office that had been boarded up for 15 years. In 1875, when Colton was just a boy, his father Jake worked the Whitmore Ranch for $30 a month and found meals. They lived in a one-room cabin behind the main house, sharing space with field mice and the occasional snake that wandered in from the prairie. Jake Briggs was a good man, honest as the day was long, but honest didn't put meat on the table when the cattle market went bad, and it didn't buy new boots when the old ones wore through. Colton remembered those days with the clarity that only comes from pain. He remembered watching his father's shoulders sag a little more each month when pay came up short, remembered the way Jake's hands would tremble slightly when he counted their meager savings by lamplight, believing his son was asleep. Most of all, he remembered the day he met Evelyn Grace and decided that someday he'd be worthy of a girl like her. She'd been sitting alone on the church steps after service, reading a book while her father, preacher Thomas Grace, talked with the other men about the weather and the price of grain. Evelyn wore a blue dress with white lace collar that had probably cost more than Jake made in 2 months, but when she looked up at Colton with those warm brown eyes, she didn't see a poor ranch hand's son. She saw a friend. "What are you reading?" Colton had asked, his voice cracking with the awkwardness of youth. "Poetry," she'd replied, holding up a leather-bound volume. "Robert Burns. Do you know him?" Colton couldn't read much beyond his own name and simple words, but he wasn't about to admit that to the prettiest girl in 3 counties. He lied, then added more honestly, "but I'd like to learn more." That was how it started. Every Sunday after church, Evelyn would sit on those steps and read to him. She taught him letters and words, showed him how stories could paint pictures in your mind, made him believe that a poor boy could dream of something bigger than mucking out stalls and mending fences. They talked about everything and nothing, shared secrets the way only children can, and somewhere between autumn and spring they fell in love with the innocent certainty that only comes before life teaches you better. The summer Colton turned 14. He worked extra hours hauling water and chopping wood to save up enough money for something special. He walked 15 miles to the trading post in Cedar Creek and spent his entire savings, $3.47, on a simple copper ring with a tiny chip of turquoise set in the center. It wasn't much, but it was everything he had. He gave it to Evelyn on a warm evening in June, down by Miller's Creek, where the cottonwoods grew thick and the water ran clear over smooth stones. They sat on a fallen log with their feet dangling in the cool water, listening to the meadowlark sing and watching the fireflies begin their nightly dance. "Evelyn Grace," Colton had said, his voice steady despite the hammering of his heart. "I know we're young, and I know I don't have much to offer, but someday I'm going to be somebody. Someday I'm going to have enough to take care of you proper. Will you wait for me? Will you marry me when we're grown?" She'd looked at the copper ring in his palm, then up at his earnest face, and smiled with all the warmth of summer sunshine. "Yes, Colton Briggs, I'll wait for you forever if I have to." She slipped the ring onto her finger, and they kissed for the first time, with all the awkward sweetness of first love. In that moment, sitting by the creek with the whole world spread out before them, anything seemed possible. For the next 4 years, they courted with the blessing of the entire town. Everyone in Mercy Ridge knew about Colton and Evelyn, how the poor boy and the preacher's daughter were meant for each other, despite the difference in their stations. Colton worked harder than any man in the territory, saving every penny he could, learning to read and write and figure numbers so he could make something of himself. Evelyn waited, with the patient devotion of a woman who believed in her man's dreams. But dreams, Colton learned, weren't enough when faced with the hard realities of life. The conversation that changed everything happened on a cold February morning in 1879, when Colton finally worked up the courage to approach Preacher Grace about marrying his daughter. Evelyn was 18 now, old enough to wed, and Colton had saved nearly $200, enough to buy a small plot of land and start building their future together. He found the preacher in his study, a cramped room behind the chapel filled with theological books and the smell of pipe tobacco. Preacher Grace was a tall, thin man with steel-grey hair and eyes that could see straight through to a man's soul. He'd been kind enough to Colton over the years, even helped teach him to read when Evelyn asked, but there had always been a distance there, a careful politeness that never quite warmed into acceptance. "Preacher Grace," Colton began, hat in hand, "I've come to ask for your daughter's hand in marriage." The older man set down his pen and looked at Colton with those penetrating eyes. "I see. And what exactly do you have to offer her, son?" Colton straightened his shoulders. "I've got near $200 saved, and old Peterson says he'll sell me 40 acres of his land for 300. I can work the difference off in labor. It's good grazing land, and I know cattle better than most men twice my age." 40 acres, Preacher Grace repeated slowly. "And you think that's enough for my daughter? You think Evelyn should spend her life scraping by on a hard-scrabble ranch, worrying about drought and cattle prices, and whether there'll be enough money to last the winter?" "We love each other," Colton said, though even to his own ears it sounded weak. "Love," the preacher shook his head. "Son, love is a fine thing, but it doesn't put food on the table or keep the cold out when winter comes. Evelyn is an educated woman. She speaks French, plays piano, has read more books than most men in this territory. She deserves a husband who can provide for her properly, not some cowhand who thinks 40 acres and good intentions are enough." The words hit Colton like physical blows. "I'll work harder. I'll find a way to make more money." "With what?" "Cattle ranching. Do you know how many men go broke trying to make a living with livestock? Do you know how many families lose everything when the market turns bad or disease hits the herd?" Preacher Grace leaned forward. "I won't see my daughter living in poverty, Colton. I won't see her grow old before her time, worn down by hardship and worry. She deserves better than that. She deserves better than you." Colton left that meeting feeling like he'd been kicked in the chest by a Mustang. But the worst was yet to come. When he told Evelyn about her father's refusal, waiting for her to say they'd find a way, waiting for her to choose their love over her father's objections, she looked at him with tears in her eyes and whispered the words that broke his heart. "Maybe Papa's right, Colton. Maybe we're too young, too different. Maybe it's better if we wait until you're more established." "Wait for what?" Colton demanded. "How established is established enough? How much money do I need to make before your father thinks I'm worthy of his daughter? She couldn't answer that question, and her silence told him everything he needed to know. The girl who had promised to wait forever was already backing away from forever when it came time to actually fight for it. That night, Colton packed his few belongings and left Mercy Ridge without saying goodbye. He was 18 years old, heartbroken, and determined to prove them all wrong. He would make his fortune, he vowed. He would become the richest man in Montana, if that's what it took. And someday, somehow, he would show them all exactly what they had thrown away. The copper ring stayed behind on Evelyn's dresser, along with everything they had promised each other by Miller's Creek. 20 years had passed since Colton Briggs left Mercy Ridge with nothing but wounded pride and a burning determination to prove his worth. Now, as his polished black carriage rolled down Main Street on that crisp October morning in 1899, he barely recognized the place that had once been his entire world. The town had aged like everything else. The paint on the storefronts had faded, several buildings stood empty with boarded windows, and the population had dwindled as young folks moved west to seek their fortunes in California or east to the growing cities. Only the church remained exactly as he remembered it, its white steeple still reaching toward the Montana sky like a prayer made of wood and hope. Colton had returned to Mercy Ridge for one reason only, to attend the funeral of old Mr. Whitmore, the rancher who had employed his father all those years ago. He owed the man that much respect, even if it meant facing the ghosts of his past. He hadn't planned to stay more than a few hours, pay his respects, tip his hat to any familiar faces, and return to his empire in Butte, where copper mines and cattle ranches had made him one of the wealthiest men in the territory. He certainly hadn't planned to be sitting in the third pew of Mercy Ridge Community Church when Evelyn Grace collapsed during her father's Sunday sermon. It happened so suddenly that for a moment everyone thought she had simply stumbled. She was standing with the choir, leading the congregation in Amazing Grace, her voice as clear and beautiful as it had been 20 years ago. Then, mid-verse, she swayed on her feet, pressed a hand to her chest, and crumpled to the floor like a flower wilting in the heat. The church erupted in concerned murmurs and scraping chairs as people rose to help. Colton found himself on his feet without thinking, his heart pounding as he watched Dr. Samuel Henderson, the same old physician who had delivered half the babies in Mercy Ridge, rush to Evelyn's side. Preacher Grace, his hair now completely white and his face deeply lined, knelt beside his daughter with panic in his eyes. "Give her air," Dr. Henderson commanded, and the crowd stepped back. He felt Evelyn's pulse, lifted her eyelids to check her pupils, and pressed his ear to her chest to listen to her breathing. What he heard there made his weathered face go pale. Evelyn stirred after a few moments, her brown eyes fluttering open with confusion. "What happened?" she whispered, trying to sit up. "Easy now, Miss Evelyn," Dr. Henderson said gently. "You fainted. We need to get you home and have a proper look at you." As they helped her to her feet, Colton caught his first clear look at the woman he had once loved more than life itself. The years had been kind to her in many ways. She was still beautiful, with the same warm eyes and gentle smile that had captured his heart as a boy. But there was a fragility about her now, a translucent quality to her skin and a thinness to her frame that spoke of declining health. She saw him then, standing among the concerned faces, and their eyes met across 20 years of silence. For a moment the church fell away, and they were just two young people sitting by Miller's Creek again, making promises they thought they could keep. "Colton," she breathed, and the sound of his name on her lips sent a jolt straight through his chest. "Miss Grace," he replied formally, touching the brim of his hat. He wanted to say more, wanted to ask if she was all right, wanted to bridge the chasm of years between them, but the words stuck in his throat like stones. Dr. Henderson insisted on examining Evelyn at the parsonage immediately, and most of the congregation followed, too worried and curious to simply go home. Colton hung back, unsure of his place in this drama, but Elder Matthews, one of the founding families and unofficial leader of the town council, approached him with purpose. "Colton Briggs," the older man said, extending a work-worn hand. "Heard you've done well for yourself up in Butte. Copper mining, isn't it?" "Among other things," Colton replied carefully. He'd learned to be cautious about discussing his wealth with people who might want something from him. "We could use a successful man like you back in Mercy Ridge," Matthews continued. "Town's been struggling since the mine closed down. Young folks leaving, businesses failing. Could use some investment, some leadership." Colton nodded politely but said nothing. He had no intention of returning to this place that held nothing but painful memories. An hour later, Dr. Henderson emerged from the parsonage with the grim expression of a man bearing terrible news. The crowd that had gathered in the small parlor fell silent as he removed his spectacles and cleaned them slowly, obviously struggling with how to begin. "I'm afraid," he said finally, "that Miss Grace is quite ill. Consumption. Her lungs are badly affected, and it's advanced further than I initially suspected." The word hit the room like a thunderclap. Consumption was a death sentence in these parts, where the nearest specialist was hundreds of miles away, and modern medical treatment was little more than wishful thinking. Preacher Grace, who had aged 10 years in the past hour, sank into his chair with his face in his hands. "How long?" he whispered. Dr. Henderson's hesitation was answer enough. "Hard to say for certain. Could be weeks, could be a few months if we keep her comfortable and well fed. But Thomas, I have to be honest with you. Without proper medical care, the kind they have back east, there's not much we can do except pray." The silence that followed was broken by a voice from the back of the room. "There has to be something," Elder Matthews said. "Some treatment, some medicine." "There might be, Doctor," Henderson admitted reluctantly. "I've read about new treatments being tried in Denver and San Francisco. Sanitarium care, special medicines, procedures that might help, but it would cost more money than most folks around here see in a lifetime." That's when Elder Matthews turned to look directly at Colton, and suddenly the older man's earlier conversation took on a different meaning entirely. "Colton," Matthews said slowly, "I wonder if we might have a word with you outside." They stood on the porch of the parsonage, Matthews joined by 2 other town elders, Peterson and Wright, men who had known Colton since he was a boy. The autumn air was crisp, carrying the scent of wood smoke and dying leaves. "Son," Matthews began, "we all remember how things were between you and Miss Evelyn before you left. We know there was talk of marriage, of a future together." Colton's jaw tightened. "That was a long time ago." "Was it?" Peterson asked. "Because from where we stood in that church, it looked like some feelings might still be there on both sides." "What exactly are you getting at?" Colton demanded. Matthews cleared his throat. "Evelyn's dying, Colton, and she's dying unmarried, without ever having the chance to be a wife or mother. It seems a crying shame for a good woman like her to pass without knowing that kind of happiness, even briefly." Wright stepped forward. "We remember the promise you made to her when you were children, about marrying her when you grew up. Maybe it's time to honor that promise." Colton stared at them in disbelief. "You want me to marry a dying woman? That's what you're asking?" "We're asking you to give her a few months of happiness before the Lord calls her home," Matthews replied firmly. "And maybe, with your resources, she might have a fighting chance. Those treatments Dr. Henderson mentioned, you could afford them, you could save her." The weight of their expectation settled on Colton's shoulders like a yoke. 20 years ago, these same men had watched him be rejected and driven away as unworthy. Now they were asking him to use the wealth they had once scorned to save the woman who had chosen her father's comfort over their love. "I need to think about this," he said. "Don't think too long," Peterson warned. "She doesn't have much time." As the elders walked away, Colton stood alone on the porch, staring up at the same Montana sky that had witnessed his boyhood dreams. Through the window, he could see Evelyn sleeping in her father's chair, looking pale and fragile as spun glass. The girl who had broken his heart was dying, and somehow, impossibly, Everyone expected him to save her. That night, alone in his room at the Mercy Ridge Inn, Colton sat by the window with a glass of whiskey and stared out at the town that had shaped him. The silver dollar in his pocket, his first earned dollar, kept all these years as a reminder of how far he'd come, seemed to burn against his leg like a coal from hell's own fire. He pulled it out and turned it over in his fingers, remembering the day he'd earned it. He'd been 19, working as a hand on a cattle drive to Denver, when the trail boss had paid him his wages after they'd delivered the herd safely through a mountain snowstorm. Most of the other cowboys had spent their money on whiskey and women within hours of reaching town, but Colton had saved every penny of that silver dollar. It represented something more than money. It was proof that he could make his own way in the world. The years that followed had been hard ones, full of 18-hour days and back-breaking labor, but Colton had possessed something most men lacked, a burning need to prove himself worthy. He'd worked cattle drives, mined silver in Colorado, even tried his hand at prospecting before discovering his real talent lay in recognizing opportunities that other men missed. The turning point had come in 1885, when he'd noticed that the played-out silver mines around Butte still contained significant copper deposits that most miners ignored. While everyone else was chasing the dream of silver strikes, Colton quietly began buying up mineral rights to worthless claims. When the demand for copper exploded with the expansion of telegraph and telephone lines, he was sitting on a fortune. But success had come at a price. The gentle boy who had given a copper ring to a preacher's daughter had transformed into a man who trusted no one completely, who measured every relationship in terms of profit and loss, who had learned to bury his emotions so deep that sometimes he wondered if they still existed at all. He'd had women over the years, well-educated ladies in Denver and San Francisco, who appreciated his wealth and social position, but none of them had ever reached the part of his heart that still belonged to a brown-eyed girl. Sitting by Miller's Creek, he'd told himself that was for the best. Love made a man weak, vulnerable, prone to making decisions with his heart instead of his head. Now here he was, being asked to marry the very woman who had taught him that painful lesson. A soft knock at his door interrupted his brooding. He opened it to find Preacher Grace standing in the hallway, hat in hand, looking older and more frail than Colton remembered. The man who had once seemed so imposing, so certain of his righteousness, now appeared to be carrying the weight of the world on his narrow shoulders. "May I come in?" the preacher asked quietly. Colton stepped aside, gesturing to a chair. Grace sat down heavily, as if his bones ached, and for a long moment neither man spoke. "I suppose you're here to talk about your daughter," Colton said finally. "I am." Grace's voice was barely above a whisper. "And about the things I said to you 20 years ago." Colton remained standing, his back straight, his expression carefully neutral. The preacher's hands trembled slightly as he spoke. "I was wrong, son. Wrong about what mattered, wrong about what made a man worthy. I thought I was protecting my daughter, but I was really protecting my own pride, my own fear of what people might say if she married beneath her station." "You said love wasn't enough," Colton reminded him, his voice cold as winter wind. "And you proved me right, didn't you?" Grace looked up with tears in his eyes. "You left. You didn't fight for her. You didn't try to change my mind or convince her to choose love over comfort. You just walked away." The accusation hit Colton like a physical blow. "I was 18 years old and had nothing to offer her but dreams and good intentions. You made it clear that wasn't enough." "You're right," Grace admitted, "but I was wrong to make you feel that way. And Evelyn was wrong not to stand up to me. We were both wrong, and now she's paying the price for our cowardice." Colton moved to the window, needing distance from the pain in the older man's voice. "What exactly are you asking me to do?" "I'm asking you to forgive us," Grace said simply, "both of us. And if there's any part of you that still cares for her, I'm begging you to help save her life." "By marrying her? By pretending that 20 years of hurt and anger can be swept away with a wedding ceremony?" "By giving her a chance," Grace replied. "Maybe the marriage starts as pretense, but there was real love between you once. Maybe there could be again, if you both had time to remember what you meant to each other. Colton turned back to face him. And if I agree to this, what happens when she recovers? Assuming the doctors can help her. Do we just go on pretending to be happily married? Do I move back to Mercy Ridge and play house while my business empire crumbles? I don't know, Grace admitted. I suppose that would be up to you and Evelyn to decide. All I know is that she's going to die without help, and you're the only one who can provide that help. After the preacher left, Colton poured himself another whiskey and walked to the window again. Down the street, he could see the parsonage where Evelyn lay sleeping, perhaps dreaming of the life she might have had if circumstances had been different. The rational part of his mind told him to leave in the morning. He owed these people nothing. They had rejected him when he needed them most, and now they expected him to solve their problems with the fortune they had once scorned. It would serve them right if he simply rode away and let fate take its course. But another part of him, the part that still carried a copper ring's worth of hope, whispered that maybe this was his chance for something he hadn't even realized he was missing. What was the point of all his success if he remained alone, if he never again felt the warmth of genuine affection, if he died as solitary and bitter as he had lived? He thought about the way Evelyn had looked at him in the church, the recognition in her eyes, the softness in her voice when she spoke his name. 20 years had passed, but some things transcended time and circumstance. Some promises, once made by Miller's Creek on a summer evening, might still carry weight, even when spoken beside a deathbed. Dawn was breaking over the Montana mountains when Colton finally made his decision. He dressed carefully in his finest suit, slicked back his hair, and walked through the crisp morning air to the parsonage. The silver dollar stayed in his pocket, a reminder of the journey that had brought him to this moment. Whatever happened next, he was about to find out if love could indeed conquer all, or if some wounds were too deep to heal, even with all the money in the world. Evelyn was sitting in the garden behind the parsonage when Colton found her, wrapped in her mother's old shawl and reading a worn copy of Robert Burns' poetry, the same book she'd shared with him all those years ago. The morning sun caught the auburn highlights in her brown hair, and for a moment he was transported back to their youth, when the future had seemed limitless and love had been the only currency that mattered. She looked up as his shadow fell across the pages, and her smile was both welcoming and uncertain. "I hoped you might come," she said softly. "May I sit?" he asked, gesturing to the empty chair beside her. "Of course." She closed the book, her fingers lingering on the worn leather cover. "I've been thinking about what the elders asked of you. It's a terrible burden to place on anyone, especially considering our history." Colton settled into the chair, acutely aware of how close they were sitting. He could smell the lavender soap she'd always favored. He could see the fine lines around her eyes that spoke of years he hadn't shared. "Evelyn, I need to know something, and I need you to be honest with me. What is it? Do you want this marriage, or are you just going along with what others have decided for you? Because I won't be part of another arrangement where your father's wishes matter more than your own." She was quiet for a long moment, her fingers absently turning her mother's simple gold wedding band that she wore on her right hand. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. 20 years ago, "I was a coward," she said. "I let my father convince me that security mattered more than love, that reputation was more important than following my heart. I chose the safe path, and I've regretted it every day since." She reached into her dress pocket and pulled out something that made Colton's breath catch in his throat. It was the copper ring he had given her by Miller's Creek, tarnished now but still bearing the tiny chip of turquoise that had cost him his entire savings. "I kept it," she continued, placing the ring in her palm where they both could see it. "Even when Papa said I should forget about you and find someone more suitable, even when other men came calling over the years. I kept it because it reminded me of the only time in my life when I was brave enough to choose love over everything else." Colton stared at the ring, remembering the boy who had walked 15 miles to buy it, the boy who had believed that love could overcome any obstacle. Why didn't you marry someone else? In 20 years, surely there were opportunities. Evelyn's laugh held no humor. There were a few, respectable men with steady incomes and proper pedigrees. But how could I marry any of them when my heart still belonged to someone else? How could I make vows to another man when the only promise that ever mattered was the one I made to you by the creek? She looked directly into his eyes, and he saw 20 years of loneliness reflected there. I know I hurt you terribly when I didn't fight for us. I know I was weak when you needed me to be strong. But if you'll have me, if you can find it in your heart to forgive me, I'd like the chance to be the woman I should have been all those years ago. The sincerity in her voice, the pain and regret and desperate hope, cut through all his carefully constructed defenses. Here was the truth he'd been afraid to hear. She had never stopped loving him, never stopped regretting the choice that drove them apart. "There's something you need to know," Colton said slowly. "I'm not the same man I was when I left here. The boy who gave you that ring was gentle, trusting, full of dreams about the future. The man sitting here now has had to be hard, calculating, sometimes ruthless. I've done things to build my fortune that the old Colton would have found unforgivable." "What kind of things?" He told her about the early years, about working for men who cheated their employees, about learning to be just as cunning and merciless as they were in order to survive. He told her about business deals where he destroyed competitors who had families to feed, about buying up debt and foreclosing on properties when the owners couldn't pay. He told her about becoming exactly the kind of man he'd once despised. "Success has a price," he finished. "And I paid it willingly because I thought wealth was the only thing that mattered. I'm not sure there's enough of the old Colton left to make you happy." Evelyn listened without judgment, her face thoughtful. When he finished, she reached over and took his hand the first time they'd touched in 20 years. "Do you remember what you used to tell me when we were children?" she asked. "About how the creek ran clear no matter how muddy the banks got during spring floods." He nodded, remembering. "You said the water always found a way to clean itself, to run pure again once the storm passed." She squeezed his hand gently. "Maybe people are like that too. Maybe the boy I fell in love with is still there underneath all the years of hurt and hardness. Maybe all he needs is time to find his way back to the surface." That afternoon, they were married in the same chapel where they'd first met as children. It was a simple ceremony, attended by most of the town despite the short notice. Evelyn wore her mother's wedding dress, the yellowed silk that had waited 20 years for this moment, while Colton stood beside her in his finest suit, feeling both like the luckiest man alive and a fraud who was playing a part he didn't deserve. Dr. Henderson had insisted that Evelyn remain seated during the ceremony to preserve her strength, so they exchanged vows with her in a chair and him kneeling beside her. When it came time for rings, Colton surprised everyone by pulling out not an expensive gold band, but the old copper ring that had started it all. 20 years late, he said as he slipped it onto her finger, but some promises are worth keeping. The reception was held in the church social hall, with food donated by practically every family in town. People who had watched their childhood courtship and witnessed their painful separation now celebrated their unlikely reunion with genuine warmth. For a few hours, it almost felt like the fairy tale ending everyone wanted it to be. But as the evening wore on and they retired to the parsonage now, their temporary home, until other arrangements could be made, the reality of their situation settled over them like a heavy blanket. They were strangers, wearing the faces of people they used to know, married for duty and compassion rather than the simple love that had once bound them together. That night, they sat in the parlor talking until dawn, sharing 20 years of separate lives, learning who they had become in each other's absence. It was a beginning, tentative and fragile, but a beginning nonetheless. 3 days after their wedding, Colton's determination to save his wife's life became a crusade that amazed even the most skeptical residents of Mercy Ridge. He dispatched telegrams to medical schools in Boston, Chicago, and San Francisco, offering whatever payment was necessary to bring the finest doctors west to examine Evelyn. Money, he had learned over the years, could accomplish miracles when applied with enough force and persistence. The first to arrive was Dr. Margaret Sinclair from the University of California Medical School, a stern-faced woman in her 40s who carried herself with the confidence of someone accustomed to being the smartest person in any room. She stepped off the train in Cedar Creek wearing a traveling suit that probably cost more than most families in Mercy Ridge earned in a year, carrying a leather medical bag that looked more like an arsenal of scientific instruments than anything Dr. Henderson had ever possessed. "Mr. Briggs," she said as Colton met her at the depot, "I must tell you that your telegram was quite persuasive, but I want to be clear about something before we proceed. I don't make house calls to wealthy men's wives just because they can afford my fees. I came because your description of your wife's symptoms suggests she might be an excellent candidate for some experimental treatments we've been developing." "Experimental?" Colton asked, suddenly concerned. "Cutting edge," Dr. Sinclair corrected. "We've had remarkable success treating consumption with a combination of high-altitude rest, specialized nutrition, and a new medication derived from willow bark and other natural compounds. The survival rate is nearly 60% when caught at the right stage." 60%. The number rang in Colton's head like church bells. It wasn't a guarantee, but it was hope, more hope than anyone in Mercy Ridge had dared to entertain since Evelyn's diagnosis. Dr. Sinclair spent 3 hours examining Evelyn, using instruments that seemed to belong more in a laboratory than a sick room. She listened to her breathing with a stethoscope that looked far more sophisticated than Dr. Henderson's simple trumpet-shaped device took her temperature with a precision thermometer and even examined samples of her blood under a portable microscope that had cost Colton an additional $50 to transport safely. When the examination was complete, Dr. Sinclair sat down with both Colton and Evelyn to discuss her findings. "The consumption is advanced," she began without preamble, "but not as far progressed as I feared. Mrs. Briggs, you have what we call a galloping case. It's moving quickly, which is dangerous, but it also means it might respond well to aggressive treatment." Evelyn gripped Colton's hand tighter. "First, we need to get you to altitude. The thin air forces your lungs to work harder and seems to help clear the infection. There's a sanatorium in Colorado Springs that specializes in consumption treatment. Second, a strict regimen of nutrition, raw eggs, milk, red meat, and plenty of rest. Third, regular doses of a medication I've developed that seems to slow the progression of the disease." "How long would the treatment take?" Colton asked. "Minimum 6 months, possibly a year, and I won't lie to you, it's expensive. Between the sanatorium fees, transportation, medications, and my continued consultation, you're looking at close to $5,000. $5,000 was more money than most people in Montana saw in a lifetime, but Colton didn't hesitate. "When can we leave?" "As soon as arrangements can be made. However, I should warn you that the journey itself is risky. Mrs. Briggs is quite weak, and traveling by train to Colorado will be taxing." "I'll hire a private car," Colton said immediately, "whatever she needs to be comfortable." That evening, as Dr. Sinclair telegraphed the sanatorium to reserve accommodations, Colton and Evelyn sat together in the garden where they'd renewed their acquaintance just days before. The autumn air carried the scent of wood smoke and dying leaves, but also something else, the faintest hint of hope. $5,000, Evelyn said softly. "Colton, that's an enormous sum." "Are you certain?" "Don't," he interrupted gently. "Don't even think about the money. I've spent more than that on a single mining claim that might turn out worthless. This isn't worthless. You aren't worthless." She was quiet for a moment, watching the last light fade behind the mountains. "I keep thinking I'm going to wake up and find this is all a dream." That you'll come to your senses and realize you're throwing away your fortune on a woman who treated you terribly. You didn't treat me terribly, Colton replied. You were 18 years old and caught between your father's expectations and your own heart. I understand that now in a way I couldn't then. I should have fought for us. We both should have done a lot of things differently. But we can't change the past, Evelyn. All we can do is try to build something better with whatever time we have left. She turned to look at him in the gathering darkness. What if the treatment doesn't work? What if I get stronger for a while and then... Then we'll have had that while, he said simply, and that will be more than we thought we'd have a week ago. The next few days passed in a whirlwind of preparation. Colton arranged for a private railway car, complete with a bedroom, sitting area, and space for Dr. Sinclair to monitor Evelyn during the journey. He hired nurses from Denver to assist with her care, purchased cases of the specialized medications Dr. Sinclair recommended, and even arranged for a chef who specialized in the high-nutrition diet that would be crucial to Evelyn's recovery. Word of these arrangements spread through Mercy Ridge like wildfire, and the town's reaction was mixed. Some people were genuinely moved by Colton's devotion to his new wife, seeing it as the most romantic story they'd ever witnessed. Others whispered that he was a fool, throwing away his hard-earned fortune on a lost cause, that no amount of money could bring back the dead. But as the day of departure approached and the entire town turned out to see them off, even the skeptics had to admit there was something magnificent about watching a man move heaven and earth for love. Dr. Henderson, who had delivered the original diagnosis with such grim certainty, shook Colton's hand at the train depot with tears in his eyes. "Son," he said, "I've been practicing medicine for 40 years, and I've never seen anything like what you're doing for that girl. If determination and love can cure consumption, she'll outlive us all." As the train pulled away from Mercy Ridge with its precious cargo, Evelyn sat by the window, watching her hometown disappear into the distance. For the first time since her diagnosis, she allowed herself to believe that she might actually see it again. The Colorado Springs Sanatorium was a marvel of modern medicine nestled against the foothills of the Rocky Mountains. But after 3 months of intensive treatment, Evelyn's improvement had plateaued. Dr. Sinclair's conventional methods had stopped the disease's rapid progression and even reversed some of the damage, but Evelyn remained weak, prone to coughing fits, and far from the robust health they all hoped to achieve. "We've reached the limits of what European medicine can accomplish," Dr. Sinclair admitted during one of their weekly consultations. "The medications are helping, but your wife's body seems to need something more, something we simply don't understand yet." Colton sat beside Evelyn's bed in their private suite, watching the frustration play across the doctor's face. For all her knowledge and modern equipment, Margaret Sinclair was encountering the same wall that had stopped countless physicians before her, the human body's mysteries that no amount of science could fully penetrate. "There has to be something else we can try," Colton insisted, "someone else we can consult." "Actually," Dr. Sinclair said slowly, "there might be. I've heard stories about native healing practices that seem to complement conventional treatment remarkably well. There's a Navajo medicine man about a day's ride south of here who's gained quite a reputation among some of my colleagues for his work with respiratory ailments." Evelyn stirred in her bed, her voice still weak but interested. "Native healing? I know how it sounds," Dr. Sinclair continued, "but I've seen too many cases where traditional medicine failed and native practices succeeded to dismiss it entirely. This particular healer, they call him Running Bear, has supposedly cured several cases that we would consider hopeless." Colton was already standing. "How do we find him?" The journey to Running Bear's camp took them through some of the most beautiful country Colton had ever seen. High mountain meadows carpeted with wildflowers and streams that ran crystal clear through stands of aspen and pine. They traveled in a specially modified wagon that Dr. Sinclair had designed for transporting fragile patients, with springs and padding to minimize the jarring of rough roads. Running Bear's encampment sat in a circular valley surrounded by red rock formations that seemed to glow in the late afternoon sun. The medicine man himself was a weathered Navajo in his 60s, with silver hair braided down his back and eyes that seemed to see straight through to a person's soul. He greeted them with a dignity that immediately commanded respect, speaking English with the careful precision of someone who had learned it as a second language. "You seek healing for the woman whose spirit fights to stay in this world," he said after studying Evelyn for several long minutes. It wasn't a question. "Yes," Colton replied. "We've tried everything the white doctors know, but she's still very sick." Running Bear nodded slowly. "The white medicine treats the body's sickness but forgets that the spirit must also be healed. Your wife carries great sadness, great regret. These things make the body weak, make it hard to fight disease." He gestured for them to sit around a small fire that burned with aromatic wood, sending sweet-smelling smoke spiraling into the evening sky. From a leather pouch decorated with intricate beadwork, he removed various herbs and roots, grinding them together with practiced movements while he spoke. "Many years ago, a white preacher came to our people and spoke of forgiveness, of laying down burdens that make the heart heavy. He was a good man, this preacher, and we listened. But we taught him something too, that healing must include the whole person, not just the part that hurts." Evelyn leaned forward despite her weakness. "What kind of healing?" "First, we cleanse the body with herbs that have helped our people for generations. Sage for purification, cedar for strength, other plants whose names I will not speak to outsiders. But more important, we cleanse the spirit of the sadness that weighs it down." Over the next 4 days, Running Bear worked with both Colton and Evelyn in ways that challenged everything they thought they knew about medicine. He prepared teas made from plants that grew high in the mountains, their bitter taste offset by honey and other natural sweeteners. He led them through rituals that seemed part prayer, part meditation, designed to help them release the guilt and regret they had carried for 20 years. "You both punish yourselves for choices made by younger people," he told them during one evening session as they sat around his fire. "But young people do not have the wisdom of years. They make mistakes because they do not know better. To keep punishing them now is like beating a horse that has already learned to obey." The most powerful moment came on their 3rd night, when Running Bear asked them to participate in what he called a speaking truth ceremony. They sat facing each other across the fire while he burned a mixture of herbs that filled the air with an almost hypnotic fragrance. "Speak the words you have never said," he instructed. "Let the fire carry away the weight you have been carrying." Evelyn went first, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm sorry I was too weak to fight for our love when we were young. I'm sorry I let my father's fears become my own. I'm sorry I wasted 20 years being afraid to live fully because I was afraid of making another mistake." Then it was Colton's turn. "I'm sorry I left without fighting harder for us. I'm sorry I let pride and hurt turn me into someone who cared more about proving his worth than remembering what really mattered. I'm sorry it took you almost dying for me to find my way back to the man I used to be." Running Bear watched them both with eyes that held generations of wisdom. "Good," he said simply. "Now the healing can truly begin." On their final day, he presented them with a small leather pouch decorated with turquoise and silver, similar to the one he used for his herbs, but smaller and more personal. "This contains plants that will help her breathing, but also a piece of stone from this sacred place," he explained. "Wear it close to your heart, and remember that healing is not just about the body becoming strong. It is about the spirit learning to fly again." The journey back to the sanatorium felt different somehow, lighter, despite Evelyn's continued physical weakness. Something had shifted between them during those days with Running Bear. Some ancient burden had been lifted that neither of them had even realized they were carrying. Dr. Sinclair noticed the change immediately when they returned. "I don't know what happened out there," she said after examining Evelyn. "But whatever it was, your body is responding differently. Your breathing is easier, your color is better, and your energy levels have improved significantly." Evelyn touched the medicine pouch that now hung around her neck, its weight both comforting and empowering. "Maybe some healing can't be measured with instruments," she suggested. For the first time since they'd met, Dr. Margaret Sinclair, the woman who believed in science above all else, had no argument to offer. 6 months after their departure from Mercy Ridge, Colton and Evelyn returned to a town buzzing with excitement about their homecoming. Word had spread through the mountain communities that the preacher's daughter had beaten consumption, that love and money had accomplished what everyone thought impossible. The train depot was crowded with well-wishers eager to see the miracle for themselves. Evelyn stepped off the train looking transformed. The skeletal thinness was gone, replaced by healthy curves. Her cheeks had color, her eyes sparkled with vitality, and her breathing was clear and strong. She still carried Running Bear's medicine pouch close to her heart, but she no longer needed it for survival. Now it served as a reminder of the spiritual journey that had saved her soul along with her body. The celebration lasted 3 days, with the entire town turning out to welcome them home. It seemed that everyone in Mercy Ridge had a story about how they'd always believed Evelyn would recover, how they'd never doubted that love could conquer even the gravest illness. For Colton and Evelyn, it was overwhelming to be the center of so much attention, but also deeply moving to see how their story had given hope to others facing their own struggles. It was during the cleanup after the final celebration dinner that Evelyn made the discovery that would change everything. She was sorting through items that had been stored in her hope chest while they were away, looking for a particular book of poetry she wanted to share with Colton, when her fingers encountered something unexpected wedged behind the chest's false back. It was a manila envelope, yellowed with age and sealed with red wax that bore her father's mark. "Colton," she called, her voice strange enough to bring him quickly to her side. "Look at this." Inside the envelope were documents that made no immediate sense. Surveyors' maps, mining claims, correspondence with various territorial offices. But as they spread the papers across the kitchen table and began to study them more carefully, a shocking picture emerged. The maps showed detailed geological surveys of land surrounding Mercy Ridge, including the supposedly worthless property that had been left to Evelyn by her grandmother years before anyone thought it had value. According to these documents, that worthless land contained what appeared to be substantial copper deposits, potentially worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. But more damning were the letters. Correspondence between Preacher Grace and Elder Matthews dating back over 2 years, discussing the mining potential and their plans to resolve the situation to everyone's benefit. References to bringing Colton back to town, to encouraging the marriage, to ensuring that the mineral rights remained within the community rather than falling into the hands of outside mining interests. The final letter, dated just 2 weeks before Evelyn's collapse during church service, was the most devastating. "Thomas, everything is arranged. The girl's condition is progressing as expected, and young Briggs should be arriving soon for Whitmore's funeral. When the time comes, we must convince him that marriage is his moral obligation. Once they're wed, the mineral rights will be secured through family connection, and we can begin development with his capital investment. The town's future depends on this plan succeeding." Evelyn stared at the letter in her hands, reading it again and again as if the words might change meaning. "They planned it," she whispered. "They planned all of it." Colton's face had gone pale, his jaw clenched so tight she could see the muscles twitching. "Your father knew about the copper before you got sick. Matthews knew. They've been manipulating this entire situation. But my illness, surely they didn't." Evelyn couldn't finish the thought. "No," Colton said quickly, moving to take her in his arms. "Your consumption was real. Dr. Sinclair confirmed that. But the timing, they must have seen an opportunity when you got sick and decided to use it." Evelyn pulled away from him, her face a mask of hurt and betrayal. All those conversations about duty and childhood promises. All that talk about giving me a chance at happiness before I died. It was just about money. It was always just about money. The cruel irony wasn't lost on either of them. 20 years ago, Colton had been rejected for being too poor to marry the preacher's daughter. Now, he'd been manipulated into marriage specifically because he was wealthy enough to develop her mineral rights. "There's more," Colton said grimly, pulling out another document from the envelope. It was a contract, already drawn up and notarized, establishing a mining partnership between the town council and any parties connected to the Grace family through marriage. All it needed was Colton's signature to become legally binding. "They had it all planned out," Evelyn said, sinking into a chair. "Marry us, get you to sign this partnership agreement, and then what? Hope I died anyway so they could inherit everything? Or hope I'd be so grateful for your recovery that I'd agree to anything they asked," Colton replied. His voice was deadly calm, but she could see the rage building behind his eyes, the same cold fury that had built his business empire and destroyed his competitors. The sound of footsteps on the front porch interrupted their discussion. Through the window, they could see Elder Matthews approaching with Preacher Grace, both men wearing the solemn expressions of community leaders on important business. "They're coming to present the partnership proposal," Colton said, quickly gathering up the papers. "They must think enough time has passed for me to be properly grateful. What do we do?" Colton's smile was sharp as a blade. "We let them make their presentation, and then we show them exactly what we've discovered." When the two men entered the parlor, they carried themselves with the confidence of people who believed they held all the cards. Matthews had brought a bottle of expensive whiskey to celebrate the occasion, while Preacher Grace carried his Bible and the contract they expected Colton to sign. "Colton, Evelyn," Matthews began warmly, "we wanted to speak with you about an exciting opportunity for the entire community. As you know, these have been hard times for Mercy Ridge, but we believe there might be a way to change that." "Oh?" Colton replied mildly, pouring whiskey for the men. "What kind of opportunity?" Preacher Grace cleared his throat nervously. "Well, son, it seems that some of the land around here, including the property that now belongs to you and Evelyn through her inheritance, might have mineral potential." "Mineral potential," Evelyn repeated flatly. "Copper, mostly," Matthews continued, warming to his subject. "Now, developing a mine is expensive business, requires significant capital investment. But with your resources and our local knowledge, we could create something that benefits everyone." He produced the contract with a flourish. "We've drawn up a partnership agreement that would give you majority ownership, of course, but also ensure that the profits help rebuild the entire community. New businesses, better roads, maybe even a railroad spur." Colton accepted the contract and pretended to study it carefully. "This is very generous of you. When did you first discover these mineral deposits?" The two older men exchanged quick glances. "Recently," Matthews said. "Very recently. We wanted to make sure Evelyn was fully recovered before presenting this opportunity." "I see." Colton stood and walked to the window, still holding the contract. "And this arrangement, it wouldn't have anything to do with the fact that you've known about the copper deposits for over 2 years, would it?" The silence in the room was deafening. Matthews's face had gone ashen, while Preacher Grace clutched his Bible like a shield. "Or perhaps," Evelyn said, rising from her chair with a stack of papers in her hand, "it has something to do with these documents we found hidden in my hope chest. Documents that show you've been planning this entire scheme since long before I got sick." When she began reading from their own correspondence, watching their carefully constructed facade crumble, Colton felt something settle in his chest. Not satisfaction exactly, but a kind of justice. The boy who had been rejected for poverty and the girl who had been used as a pawn were about to show these manipulative men exactly what they thought of their schemes. The reckoning had finally arrived. The confrontation in the parlor stretched on for nearly an hour, with Matthews and Preacher Grace alternately denying the evidence, making excuses for their actions, and finally attempting to justify their deception as being for the good of the community. Through it all, Colton sat with the deadly calm of a man who had learned to control his emotions in business negotiations, while Evelyn's disappointment in her father was palpable in every line of her body. "You have to understand," Preacher Grace pleaded, his voice breaking with desperation. "I was trying to protect everyone. The town is dying, Colton. Young people leaving. Businesses failing. When we discovered the mineral surveys, it seemed like Providence, a way to save Mercy Ridge and bring you and Evelyn back together at the same time." "By lying to us," Evelyn said, her voice cold as winter wind. "By manipulating my illness and his sense of honor." "Your illness was real," Matthews interjected quickly. "We never wished harm on you, child. We just, when you got sick, and when Colton came back for Whitmore's funeral, it seemed like fate was giving us an opportunity to make things right." Colton finally spoke, his voice quiet but carrying an undertone of menace that made both older men shift uncomfortably. "Make things right? You mean profit from my wife's near-death experience and my feelings of guilt about the past?" "Now, see here," Matthews began, but Colton cut him off with a gesture. "No, you see here. 20 years ago, you people decided I wasn't good enough for Evelyn because I didn't have money. Now you've decided I'm perfect for her specifically because I do have money. Do you understand how that looks to someone who spent 2 decades learning to recognize exactly this kind of manipulation?" He stood and walked to the mantelpiece, where his father's old Colt revolver sat in a place of honor, one of the few possessions he'd kept from his childhood. His hand didn't move toward the weapon, but both men noticed where his gaze had fallen. "The question now," Colton continued, "is what we do about this situation. You've committed fraud, conspiracy, probably several other crimes that a territorial judge might find interesting. You've betrayed the trust of 2 people who considered you family, and you've done it all while hiding behind the Bible and community service." Preacher Grace's hands trembled as he clutched his scripture. "Son, please, I know what we did was wrong, but it came from a place of love. Love for my daughter, love for this community. Love?" Evelyn's laugh held no humor whatsoever. "Papa, you were willing to use my potential death as a tool to manipulate a man into marriage. You hid the truth from me about property that belonged to me. How is any of that love?" "Because I wanted to see you happy," Grace burst out. "Because I knew you'd never stopped loving him, and I thought maybe this was God's way of bringing you together again. The mineral rights, that was just a way to make sure the community benefited too." "And if I had died?" Evelyn asked quietly. "If the treatments hadn't worked and I'd passed away as everyone expected? Would you have told Colton the truth then, or would you have let him spend the rest of his life believing he'd married me out of duty?" The silence that followed was answer enough. Matthews, sensing that his partner's emotional appeals weren't working, tried a different approach. "Look, Colton, I understand you're angry. You have every right to be. But consider the bigger picture here. Yes, we should have been honest from the beginning, but the fundamental opportunity remains sound. Those copper deposits are real, and they could make everyone in this valley wealthy beyond imagining." "Everyone?" Colton's voice was dangerously soft. "Or just the men who were clever enough to manipulate the situation to their advantage?" "The whole community would benefit, under a partnership agreement that you wrote in secret, with terms you negotiated without consulting the actual owners of the mineral rights." Colton picked up the contract from the table where it lay forgotten. "An agreement that gives you and your associates 30% of all profits in perpetuity, plus management fees, plus first rights to purchase any additional claims. That's quite generous to yourselves." Elder Matthews's face flushed red. "Those are standard terms for this kind of arrangement. These are terms designed to enrich a handful of men, while the people who actually own the land get a minority share of their own wealth." Colton's business experience was showing now, the same razor-sharp analysis that had made him rich, cutting through their carefully constructed justifications. "Did you really think I wouldn't recognize a swindle when I saw one?" The meeting ended with both men leaving the parsonage under a cloud of mutual recrimination and barely suppressed threats. Matthews warned that the town council would not take kindly to being shown up by an outsider who'd forgotten where he came from, while Preacher Grace made vague references to the damage that public scandal could do to everyone involved. After they were gone, Colton and Evelyn sat in their parlor, trying to process the full scope of what they'd discovered. The woman who had nearly died in his arms just months before was now revealed to be one of the wealthiest landowners in Montana, while the marriage that had seemed like a desperate last chance at redemption was exposed as an elaborate con game. "What do we do now?" Evelyn asked, her voice small and uncertain. Colton was quiet for a long time, staring into the fire that had burned down to glowing coals. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of 20 years of hard-won wisdom. "We have several choices," he said slowly. "We can leave, pack up tonight and disappear, let them keep their secrets and their schemes. We can expose them publicly, destroy their reputations and probably split the town apart in the process. Or we can find a third option." "What kind of third option?" "The kind that gives us control of our own destiny, while making sure justice is served." He turned to look at her, and she saw something in his eyes that reminded her of the determined boy who had walked 15 miles to buy her a copper ring. "But it's going to require us to be united in a way we've never been before. No secrets, no holding back, no protecting each other from difficult truths." Evelyn reached for his hand. "Tell me what you're thinking." "I'm thinking that Matthews is right about one thing: those copper deposits could transform this entire region, but not under his terms and not with his leadership. What if we developed the mining claims ourselves, on our own terms, with genuine benefit to the community? Without the town council? Without the corrupt members of the town council? There are good people in Mercy Ridge, honest families who've struggled through hard times without resorting to fraud and manipulation. They deserve better than what Matthews and your father were planning." Evelyn nodded slowly. "It would mean staying, making our home here permanently." "It would, and it would mean taking on Matthews and his allies directly. These aren't the kind of men who give up easily when money is involved." "Is that what you want? To stay and fight?" Colton considered the question carefully. 6 months ago he would have walked away without looking back. But 6 months ago he'd been a different man, harder, more cynical, focused only on his own success and protection. The journey with Evelyn, the healing they'd both undergone, had changed something fundamental in his character. "I want to build something worthwhile with the woman I love," he said finally. "I want to prove that success doesn't have to come at the expense of other people's welfare. And yes, I want to show Elder Matthews and his friends what real community leadership looks like." "Then we stay," Evelyn said simply. "We stay and we fight, and we build something better than what they had planned. It won't be easy. They'll use every weapon they have: social pressure, economic leverage, probably legal challenges to our ownership claims." "Let them try," she replied, and for the first time since discovering the hidden documents, she smiled with something approaching her old spirit. "They forget that I grew up in this town too. I know which families can be trusted and which ones have been in Matthews's pocket all along. And you," she squeezed his hand, "you've spent 20 years learning how to outmaneuver men exactly like him." That night, they sat up until dawn, planning their strategy. By the time the sun rose over the Montana mountains, they had the framework for a campaign that would either establish them as the leaders Mercy Ridge needed or destroy their reputations and drive them from the territory forever. The choice was made. The battle for the soul of Mercy Ridge was about to begin. The Mercy Ridge Community Hall had never seen a gathering quite like the one that assembled on that cold November evening. Word had spread through the valley that Colton and Evelyn Briggs had called for a public meeting to discuss matters of vital importance to the future of our community, and curiosity had drawn nearly every adult within 20 miles to attend. Elder Matthews sat in the front row with his supporters, a collection of businessmen and landowners who had profited from various schemes over the years. They wore the confident expressions of men who believed they controlled the narrative, who thought they could weather whatever storm a grateful husband and his recovered wife might try to raise. Preacher Grace sat apart from the others, his Bible clutched in trembling hands and his face bearing the hollow look of a man who had lost his moral compass and was struggling to find his way back. Since the confrontation 3 days earlier, he had aged visibly, as if the weight of his deception was literally crushing him. Dr. Henderson was there, along with the families who had genuinely celebrated Evelyn's recovery. The Petersons, the Wrights, the young couple who ran the general store, honest working people who had no idea they were about to witness their community's leadership exposed as corrupt. Colton stood at the front of the hall with a leather portfolio in his hands, looking every inch the successful businessman in his tailored suit. But there was something different about him now, something that went beyond mere wealth and confidence. He carried himself with the authority of a man who had found his true purpose. Beside him, Evelyn sat in a simple wooden chair, her color strong and her breathing clear. The woman who had nearly died in this same building months earlier now radiated health and vitality, but more importantly, she radiated resolve. The town charter lay spread across the table before them, the original founding documents of Mercy Ridge that Colton had requested from the territorial office. "Friends and neighbors," Colton began, his voice carrying easily through the packed hall. "6 months ago, many of you witnessed what you believed to be a deathbed marriage between myself and Evelyn. You thought you were seeing a dying woman granted her final wish by a man honoring a childhood promise." He paused, letting his gaze sweep across the assembled crowd. "What you were actually witnessing was the culmination of an elaborate scheme designed to defraud both my wife and myself of property rights worth hundreds of thousands of dollars." The murmur that rippled through the crowd was immediate and shocked. Matthews started to rise from his seat, but Colton's raised hand stopped him. "Please hold your comments until I've finished, Elder Matthews. I believe everyone deserves to hear the full truth before we discuss responses." Colton opened his portfolio and began displaying the hidden documents they had discovered. Maps, surveys, correspondence, all spread across the table where everyone could see them. As he explained each piece of evidence, the crowd's murmur grew into a buzz of outrage and disbelief. "These documents show that certain members of our town council have known about valuable mineral deposits on my wife's inherited property for over 2 years," he continued. "They also show a deliberate plan to manipulate our marriage in order to gain access to those mining rights through fraudulent partnership agreements." Mrs. Peterson gasped audibly when Colton read from the letter discussing how Evelyn's illness provided the perfect opportunity for their scheme. Other families began looking at Matthews and his associates with expressions ranging from shock to disgust. "Furthermore," Colton said, picking up the town charter, "according to the original founding documents of Mercy Ridge, any mineral rights discovered on property within the township boundaries must be developed for the benefit of all residents, with profits distributed according to need and contribution. The partnership agreement these men prepared for my signature would have violated that provision entirely." Elder Matthews finally stood, his face red with anger and embarrassment. "That charter provision was written 50 years ago when this was just a mining camp. It has no bearing on modern business arrangements." "On the contrary," Evelyn said, rising from her chair with quiet dignity, "territorial law specifically upholds original township charters unless they're formally amended through proper legal procedures, which, according to county records, has never been done." She faced the crowd directly, her voice carrying the strength that had seen her through months of illness and recovery. "My friends, my neighbors, people I've known since childhood, I want you to understand something. My husband and I could leave here tonight and develop those copper claims anywhere we choose. We could take our wealth and make our lives somewhere that holds no painful memories, no complicated relationships." The hall fell completely silent. "But we're not going to do that," she continued, "because this is our home and you are our people, and we believe Mercy Ridge can be something better than a place where a few men grow rich by deceiving their neighbors." Matthews stood again, his voice sharp with desperation. "This is all very dramatic, but what exactly are you proposing? To destroy the reputations of men who've served this community for decades over a business disagreement?" Colton smiled, and there was something almost predatory in the expression. "I'm proposing that we follow the law, Elder Matthews. All of it." The phrase, "all of it," hung in the air like smoke from a gunshot, and Elder Matthews's confident expression began to crumble as he realized there might be more revelations coming. Colton reached into his portfolio once more and withdrew a thick folder that he hadn't shown anyone, not even Evelyn. "You see, when I requested the territorial records for Mercy Ridge, I didn't just ask for the town charter. I asked for all official documents related to this township, including mining claims, tax records, and correspondence with territorial offices." He opened the folder with deliberate slowness. What I discovered was fascinating. It turns out that Elder Matthews and his associates have been filing mineral claims on township property for over 3 years, claims that should have been filed by the township itself under the charter provisions. Dr. Henderson leaned forward in his seat. "It means they've been stealing from the community," Evelyn said quietly, her voice carrying clearly through the stunned silence. "They've been using their positions of trust to claim mineral rights that legally belong to all of us." Matthews shot to his feet, his face purple with rage. "This is outrageous. Those claims were filed legally and properly. Under false pretenses," Colton interrupted, pulling out a map marked with colored boundaries. "You filed these claims by listing yourselves as private landowners when you were actually acting as township officials. You used your access to township records to identify the most valuable properties, then filed personal claims before the rightful information could be made public." The crowd's murmur had become an angry buzz. Families who had struggled through hard winters while the town council lived in relative comfort were beginning to understand just how deeply they had been betrayed. Peterson stood up from his seat near the back. "I'm saying they violated both territorial law and the founding charter of this community," Colton replied. "And according to the Territorial Mining Office, the penalties for fraudulent claims include forfeiture of all rights and criminal prosecution." Preacher Grace finally spoke, his voice broken and barely audible. "Stop." The hall turned to look at him as he rose on unsteady legs, his Bible clutched against his chest like a shield. "It's true," he whispered. "All of it. We knew about the copper deposits years ago. We planned to use my daughter's illness to bring Colton back, to arrange a marriage that would give us access to his capital. And yes, we filed those mining claims illegally." The admission hit the room like a physical blow. Several people gasped, while others sat in stunned silence. "Papa," Evelyn said softly, and the pain in her voice was evident to everyone present. Grace looked at his daughter with tears streaming down his weathered cheeks. "I told myself it was for the good of the community, that everyone would benefit in the end, but the truth is, I was afraid. Afraid of losing what little influence I had, afraid of watching this town die while I stood helpless to save it." He turned to address the crowd directly. "I betrayed my calling, my daughter, and all of you. I let greed and fear corrupt everything I claimed to believe in. Matthews convinced me that this was our only chance to save Mercy Ridge, but what we really did was destroy the trust that holds a community together." Elder Matthews looked around the hall desperately, seeing his support crumbling as families who had trusted him for decades began to understand the scope of his betrayal. "You can't just overturn years of legitimate business." "There was nothing legitimate about it," Dr. Henderson interrupted, rising from his seat with surprising authority. "I may not understand mining law, but I understand right and wrong, and what you men did was wrong." Colton stepped forward, sensing the moment had come for resolution. "The question now is what we do about it. We can pursue criminal charges, drag this through territorial courts for years while lawyers get rich and the community suffers. Or we can find a better way. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a simple envelope. This morning, my wife and I drew up papers establishing the Mercy Ridge Community Trust. Under this arrangement, all mineral rights within the township will be held collectively, with profits distributed according to the original charter provisions. Evelyn stood beside her husband. Every family in Mercy Ridge will receive an equal share. Every family will have a voice in how the mining is conducted. And every family will benefit from whatever prosperity comes from this land. Furthermore, Colton continued, any man who participated in the fraudulent claims has a choice. Resign from the town council, make full restitution of any profits already taken, and accept a standard family share like everyone else, or face criminal prosecution and forfeiture of all rights. The hall erupted in discussion as families turned to each other, voices rising in excitement, anger, and hope. For the first time in years, the people of Mercy Ridge were talking about a future where everyone might prosper together. Matthews looked around frantically, but his closest allies were already moving away from him, unwilling to be associated with his schemes any longer. The web of corruption that had controlled the town for years was unraveling before everyone's eyes. All in favor of establishing the community trust, Dr. Henderson called out, taking charge as the senior member of the legitimate town leadership. Hands shot up throughout the hall, dozens of them, representing families who had dreamed of something better but never dared hope it might actually come to pass. The vote was unanimous among everyone except Matthews and his two remaining supporters, who sat in stunned silence as their years of careful manipulation crumbled into dust. 6 months later, the sound of the new school bell echoed across Mercy Ridge as children ran out to play in the spring sunshine. The bronze bell had been cast in Denver using the first profits from the community copper mine, and its clear, sweet tone seemed to announce that hope had returned to the valley at last. Evelyn stood in the doorway of their new home, a modest house they'd built on a hill, overlooking the town, listening to the bell and watching the children play. Her health had continued to improve until now she was stronger than she'd been since childhood, and the medicine pouch Running Bear had given her hung around her neck more as a reminder of spiritual strength than physical necessity. Beautiful sound, Colton said, coming up behind her and wrapping his arms around her waist. It is, she agreed, leaning back against his chest. Mrs. Patterson was saying yesterday that enrollment has doubled since families started moving back to town. Young people who left to find work elsewhere are coming home. Through the window, they could see the bustling activity of a community transformed. New businesses lined Main Street, a proper hotel, an expanded general store, a restaurant that served travelers arriving on the new railroad spur. The mining operation employed over 100 men with fair wages and safe working conditions, while the community trust ensured that every family in the valley shared in the prosperity. It hadn't all been smooth sailing. Elder Matthews had chosen criminal prosecution over resignation and restitution and was currently serving 2 years in the territorial prison for fraud. Several other men had left town rather than face the consequences of their actions. But for every person who departed in shame, 2 families had arrived looking for the kind of community where honest work was valued and everyone had a voice in their collective future. Dr. Henderson had been elected as the new head of the town council, with a mandate to ensure transparent governance and equal representation. The young couple who ran the general store now served as the community's advocates for small business development, while Peterson had become the supervisor of mining operations. Perhaps most remarkably, Preacher Grace had found his way back to the man he was meant to be. His public confession and genuine repentance had earned him forgiveness from most of the community, and his sermons now focused on themes of redemption, second chances, and the importance of putting community welfare above personal gain. He and Colton had even begun to develop something resembling a real relationship, built on mutual respect, rather than the old dynamics of class and status. "There's something I want to show you," Colton said, taking Evelyn's hand and leading her to the small desk where he conducted business correspondence. From the drawer, he pulled out a letter bearing the seal of the territorial governor's office. "This arrived yesterday." Evelyn read the formal language with growing excitement. The letter officially commended the Mercy Ridge Community Trust as a model for equitable resource development that other townships should study and emulate. More importantly, it announced the governor's intention to visit personally to see how their experiment in community ownership was working. "We're going to have important visitors," she said with a smile. "More than that," Colton replied. "If this model works here, if we can prove that communities can prosper without a few men controlling all the wealth, it could change how development happens throughout the territory." They walked out into their garden, where spring flowers were beginning to bloom among the vegetables Evelyn had planted. The same mountains that had watched their childhood romance still surrounded the valley, but everything else had changed. Where once there had been a struggling town controlled by corrupt men, now there was a thriving community built on principles of fairness and shared prosperity. "Do you ever think about what might have happened if we'd made different choices when we were young?" Evelyn asked, settling onto the bench Colton had built under their apple tree. "Sometimes," he admitted, "but I think we needed to go through everything we did to become the people we are now. The boy who gave you that copper ring was sincere, but he didn't understand how complex the world really is, and the girl who received it was sheltered, protected from the harsh realities that shape character." He pulled her hand to his lips and kissed the gold band that had replaced the copper ring in their renewed wedding ceremony the month before. "We needed to learn about loss and betrayal and the price of success before we could build something lasting together. And now we know that love isn't just feeling, it's choosing to work together towards something bigger than ourselves. It's building a life that makes the world a little better than we found it." The sound of laughter drew their attention back to the town below, where children were playing a game of tag around the new schoolhouse. Some of those children belonged to families who had lived in Mercy Ridge for generations, while others belonged to newcomers drawn by the promise of fair opportunity and honest governance. "What do you think our children will see when they look back at this place?" Evelyn asked softly. Colton followed her gaze to the playing children, understanding the hope in her voice. They had been talking about starting a family, about the possibility of bringing new life into the world they were building together. "I think they'll see proof that people can choose to do better," he said. "That communities don't have to be controlled by the wealthy and powerful, that prosperity can be shared, that second chances are possible when people have the courage to forgive and the wisdom to learn from their mistakes." As evening fell over Mercy Ridge, the bronze bell chimed one final time, calling families home for supper. The sound echoed off the mountains and across the valley, a voice of hope that would ring out for generations to come, a reminder that sometimes the richest hearts are indeed the ones that nearly broke, and that love, when tempered by wisdom and commitment, can transform not just two people, but an entire world. In the distance, a train whistle sounded as the evening passenger service approached the depot, bringing more families to the town that had learned the difference between prosperity and greed, between leadership and manipulation, between love as feeling and love as action. The story of Colton and Evelyn Briggs had become the story of Mercy Ridge itself, a tale of redemption, second chances, and the power of choosing hope over fear, community over individual gain, and enduring love over temporary comfort.